Hi, everyone. This is our second interview in the podcast series on mindset and performance. I sit down with rowing world champion and Olympic silver medalist Annie Vernon of Great Britain. Annie is the author of the book, Mind Games, Determination, Doubt, and Lucky Socks, The Psychology of Elite Athletes. The book aims to show how elite athletes train their mental skills in exactly the same way that they train their physical skills. Our conversation takes you through some of the key elements from her book as well as her experience as a world-class rower. Here are a few words from Annie.
In Mind Games, I wanted to explore how elite sports performers have trained their mental skills in exactly the same way they've trained their physical skills. Because the general public is really comfortable with the idea that to reach the top in elite sport, you have to spend hours and hours and hours in the gym, out on the training pitch, on the water, swimming, rowing, running, whatever it is. You have to spend hours and hours doing that to perfect your skills and perfect your fitness. But what the general public doesn't necessarily understand is that exactly the same level of preparation and trial and error and practice has gone into the mental side. And that's the bit I really wanted to show. I wanted to trace how you go from being a regular kid with a few interesting mental attributes to actually being this unbelievable performer who has confidence better than the average population, has levels of resilience, who's able to work in a team really, really effectively, who can channel their competitiveness in a positive and an upbeat way. That stuff doesn't happen by chance. And I wanted to show that elite sports performers mentally are not born, they are made.
Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast, a podcast focused on scientific and real-world expertise on training strategies between your ears, behind the oar handle, on the field and court, and in the strength and conditioning room. I'm your host, Joe DeLeo. I am a strength and conditioning coach, speaker, and lifelong student focused on continuous improvement. Thank you for joining me, and let's roll to today's episode. Annie, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
My pleasure. You put together a fantastic resource for athletes, and actually really enjoyed reading the book. It was wonderful to kind of get some insight along athletes' journey throughout their career and what's in between their ears and what they think on a day-to-day basis, whether it's training, competition, that type of thing. So we've got a really good interview in store, kind of breaking down some hopefully good questions I tried to pull out of the book that we can discuss, and look forward to sharing this with the rowing community.
Great. Well, I can't wait to get stuck in.
Cool. So I kind of started with chapter 3, which is titled Coming to Violence Over Trivial Pursuit, Competitiveness and Elite Athletes. And so one of the areas that athletes have to deal with is the fact that they're sort of always constantly being measured. You have this great section titled "Every Day There's a Spreadsheet Working for You." So let's just kind of discuss I guess what it's like to sort of feel a little bit like a lab rat, like you're constantly being measured, prodded, poked,
Yeah.
physiologically, how you stack up against your teammates, and the pros and cons of this in terms of development, and that sort of thing.
Well, I think it's one of those things that if you don't like the idea of everything that you do being tested, don't become an elite athlete, because that is the reality of it. Is it control? Yes. Is it coaches and support staff wanting to have control? Yes, it is. But ultimately, in order to improve every facet of your performance, you need to be comfortable with the idea that every facet of your performance is going to be tested. So when I was on the rowing team, it was clearly every morning: weight, sleep quality, hydration, level of urea, calories in, calories out, training numbers, hydration numbers, body fat numbers, before you even get to the stuff that actually matters, which in rowing is how fast can you go in a boat. So I think it's one of those things whereby you just get comfortable in that environment. And not only do you get comfortable, you start to love it. And actually you start to test yourself against other people, even if you don't need to, which is why And I suppose this is what I really wanted to achieve with the book, is I wanted to show that elite athletes, they are the way they are because they've trained it. Nobody started out desiring to compete against their fellow athletes on every single level, but you end up in an environment where that's a good thing to be. So you start out being a tiny bit more competitive. Probably you're the kid in school who's always trying to race everyone. And then throughout your journey through elite sport, you train that part of you, you train that part of your brain so that it becomes overwhelming, and actually you become really competitive, and you love the fact that everything you do is entered on a spreadsheet and given a ranking, so that this morning in weight training you were lifted the second biggest power cleans, and in the afternoon your ergo scores were 0.1 off where they normally are, and actually you learn how to love that part of it.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that kind of brings me right to one of the next points I have. You talk about intrinsic versus external, competitiveness.
Yes.
And, some of the athletes that you spoke to and interviewed throughout the book had each of those to certain degrees. But why is it important, you think, probably for the long haul, if you're going to be in elite sport or just you're trying to progress in a sport over time, is it important to have that intrinsic versus the external competitiveness?
Well, I think this really varies person to person, and again, that's really is what I wanted to achieve with the book. I wanted to show that everyone's different. Some people are really motivated by beating other people and objectively being, the best in the world or being on a podium. And some people are really motivated by just being the best version of themselves. And it is a much more intrinsic, self-referencing motivation. And actually, it doesn't mean one is stronger than the other at all. It just means people are wired differently. So you've got people absolutely killing themselves in the boat, attempting to be a world champion, next to people who are saying, oh, do you know what, let's just see if I can push this a bit further because I've never done that before and I want to see how good I can be. And they don't really care about the fact they're going to be a world champion. That's not their driving motivation. Personally, as I say in the book, I always found my internal opponent tougher than any external opponent. The Germans, the Ukrainians, the Americans, they came and went, but I was always there. And I was always my harshest critic. And I'm sure that, I'm not saying I'm any different to lots of other elite athletes, but, my standards were always just above where I wanted them to, where I was at that moment. So I think intrinsically, you're always going to be driving yourself. If you don't have that intrinsic drive inside you, you probably won't have got to the standard of professional sports. But there has to be that extrinsic measurement as well, because ultimately that's how you're judged. But it's definitely, I would say it's a really interesting mix between the two. Some people are really focused on, the Canadians beat us last year. I am going to absolutely smash the Canadians next year. And I'm going to think about the Canadians in every single training session I do. And other people aren't that bothered about it. For some people, their focus, it's like the target in a gun. The focus of those crosshairs is absolutely on another crew. Other people, they're almost looking to their own heart and their own soul, and the motivation is there.
Yeah, and you did a great job throughout the book of providing examples of both of those, which I thought was pretty interesting. Just sort of hearing the different perspectives of what was allowing some of these athletes to kind of sustain training for years and years and years. What drove them. And then one question I thought was really jumped out at me. On page 70, you talk about kind of why competitiveness can be a dangerous thing if it's never good enough, and particularly not necessarily or potentially with sport, but really when it kind of spills over into life. How that can bleed over into life and affect friendships, relationships, work, that type of thing, where that mindset of it's never good enough. So let's discuss that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. And I suppose this really is that all character traits are good in moderation, but in overdrive can be dangerous. Confidence, too much confidence is arrogance. Confidence is a good thing. Arrogance is not a good thing. And it's exactly the same with competitiveness. Yeah, it's great to be competitive and want to test yourself and be measured and be ranked. That's great. But if it gets to the point where you're saying nothing I ever do is good enough, well, that's bad. That's dangerous. And that's, I think, where you see athletes who, they're never satisfied. Perhaps after they retire, they really struggle, because it's the people who never were able to say, do you know what, that wasn't a perfect performance, but it was fine, it was good enough. And I think those words, good enough, is a really critical part of elite sport, personally. And I think, and as you all know with your work with athletes, I think every athlete goes through that journey to realise that actually they are good enough. It might take them a while to realise that. It might be after their first international representation, it might be after their 10th, but eventually people will look around them and say, actually, yeah, I deserve to be in this changing room. I deserve to be wearing my national flag. I deserve to be representing my country. I am good enough. But what becomes dangerous is when, the competitiveness is too strong and you never think that you're good enough. You'd always need to be better.
Yeah, that's an excellent point there, and I think, whenever we as individuals have that opportunity at some point in our career to kind of realize that we have a seat at the table, we belong.
Sure.
That's important. One thing that kind of jumped to my mind when I was reading that area of the book, that you didn't touch upon, and I think is different, say, from maybe when like Steve Redgrave was rowing compared to, present day, and towards the end of your career is social media, and just that always, being able to have access to, comparing yourself to other athletes out there. And it's not something that any athlete has really kind of readily had to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm.
And did you find anything in kind of your research where athletes talked about that at all?
Not necessarily, I guess, because I was competing at a time when, social media was there, but not many people were interested in it.
Yeah.
And the same with smartphones. Some people had smartphones, but it was pretty rare. Personally, I think social media, there's very little that's positive about it, to be honest. It's not social, is it? It's antisocial. It's horrible, people shouting at each other. And I think it's really interesting because we always used to say, never give your opposition another reason to hate you because they already hate you. So why write a blog or why write something publicly available they might read that could wind them up and could give them an extra 1% motivation? And I kind of think that's what social media is. If I was having a day where I was struggling with my motivation, I'd probably go on the Instagram account of, one of my competitors from overseas and say, oh, right, this idiot, she reckons she's lifted some really good weights in the gym. We'll see about that. And so I don't know. Maybe I'm unique, but I kind of think social media in elite sport, it is a way of finding motivation where perhaps none existed. And I kind of think the old days when you wouldn't see other athletes until you turned up at the competition venue was probably a slightly more relaxed way to live. But at the same time, it's it is really powerful if you can use it in a positive way. If you've got lots of kids following you and you can show that actually the reason you're a successful athlete is because you train really hard and you're in the gym on Christmas Day and you're going to bed early with a healthy dinner, well, that's a really positive message to send, isn't it? What annoys me is when you see athletes just posting about their blooming sponsorship contracts all the time.
Yeah.
I just think that's not a positive footprint to leave. But anyway, I won't rant.
No, that's a great point. That's a great point. It could be used for either of those endeavors. So that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
So, kind of jumping to some of the next bullet points I had here. So when you first started off rowing at 17, you did it because you loved it. And there was, at that time, there was a huge internal motivation of getting better and having fun. And I think a little bit of the social aspect to it.
Yeah.
And then as you continued to develop and you became better and moved towards international competition, some of that motivation, that drive switched towards an extrinsic focus or external focus. And, for you, you talked about in the book, the goal became success and winning. And so let's discuss a little bit, however, the years of continuing to train, the motivation for athletes can evolve, right? There's an evolutionary process.
Absolutely. And I think that the important thing to remember, and this is one of my key drivers behind writing the book, is that athletes change. And that's the whole point. The difference between me as a 16-year-old and me as a 26-year-old with 5 years of international rowing under my belt yeah, physically, I was completely different. Physically, I was not the same person, but mentally, I was not the same person. I'd spent 5 years training my muscles and training my lungs and training the blood supply around my body. I'd also spent 5 years training my confidence, training my motivation, training my resilience, training my teamwork, training all the mental side. And that's what I wanted to put across in the book, that mental the mental attributes that elite athletes have, they are not born with. Those are made. Those are trained. They're developed. They're trial and error. They're honed under pressure. So does your motivation change as you go through? Of course it does. Of course it does. I mean, when I was at university and I'd skip down to training before lectures and, go off and have a fry up afterwards, rowing had a very different role in my life to when I was 24 and attempted to go to the Olympics for the first time, where I certainly did not have a fry up, sadly. And of course it does. Again, if you'd asked me as a 16-year-old, do you want to go and win an Olympic gold medal? I probably would have said, well, that doesn't really mean anything to me. I can't. Why would I go to the Olympics? I'm just some kid. Why would that ever be part of my dream? Again, fast forward to 24, 25. I'd been to the World Championships. I was in the pathway. I was on that conveyor belt heading towards the games. Ask me then, do you want to go to the Olympics and win a gold medal? I would have said, absolutely. That's my goal. That's my aim. And I think I can do it. So I think it would be, of course, the love for the sport has to be there. But I think your motivation and what drives you, of course, it changes under events in the same way that, my motivation now is very different to what it was when I was an athlete. I mean, in the book, I'm pretty upfront about the fact that when I was an international, I didn't do it because I loved it. I did it because I really wanted to be the best in the world at it. Yeah. Is that a healthy attitude? No. If there's one thing I could have changed about myself, it's that I would have turned back time and said, look, just focus on enjoy the journey more. Enjoy the fact you're a professional athlete. But my attitude was, I'm not here to enjoy it. I'm here to be successful. And I'm absolutely not saying that's the right attitude to have, but that was my attitude. And I don't think it's necessarily healthy, but that was the way I was at the time. And I guess that's the message I try and give young athletes now is take a bit of time to breathe, look around and enjoy yourself rather than just focusing on the next competition, the next race, the next trial. Instead of kind of ticking those bits off, just think about the day to day and just think about the amazing lifestyle that you have.
Yeah, that's so important. I'm glad you're able to share that with the younger generation, because it's sometimes you get caught up in everything and you're just trying to get to tick the next box off. And
sure, in the same way, and that's not really any different to any young person. Most 17-year-olds are just desperate to turn 18. Once you're 18, you're desperate to turn 19. Then you're desperate to, start thinking about buying a house and getting a decent car. And, when you're young, you always want the next thing. Then you get to, your mid-30s and you say, right, let's just relax now and enjoy it. Or maybe this is just me getting old. I'm not sure.
Well, I feel that way, so that makes sense to me. There's a couple really good examples that jumped out at me in the book from some other fellow rowers. So Pinson and I believe Redgrave talk about, like, they said winning is addictive and trying to stay at the top. And they use that as an example of some of their motivation. And then Frances Houghton, she talked about for her trying to get to that next level of performance was shifting motivation and freeing herself from stress allowed her to perform. Reframing allowed her to perform better. And so I'm guessing, as you interviewed a lot of these athletes, each one, again, had kind of different things, different tools that worked for them at different times in their career. Is that accurate?
Yeah, very much so. And I think the the four people you've mentioned, Steve Redgrave, Matt Pinson, Katherine Granger and Fran Houghton, they all had very long careers. They all went to 4 or 5 Olympic Games. Now, I mean, my career was 2 Olympic Games. So, they're coming in from a completely different perspective. But absolutely, I mean, particularly Katherine was really interesting on this because she said, not only did I change as a person, the ages of the people around me changed. I went from being the fresh-faced, young, naive newcomer to the wise old, been there, done it, got the silverware. But also what she wanted to get out of it. probably changed. I think it was Matthew Pinsent said, in some ways, doing it again and again and again is so much harder than doing it for the first time. That in itself was a motivation. It wasn't that, it's not that your fourth gold medal is different to your first gold medal. It's that, it's so much harder to keep doing it. Turning up and winning a gold medal for the first time is amazing, but actually, can you win it for a fourth time? There's so few people who have achieved that level of success. That nature of the challenge really excited him. But I think the way that Katherine phrased it is that she said, it was really easy in the first few years of her time on the rowing team. Yeah, she was this young, naive person, and she came in with some crazy ideas, but people let her talk and people let her have that role. Fast forward 15 years, and then she's the wise old head, and people look to her for all the answers. But she said, no, the challenge then is to still say to the young people, look, what are your crazy ideas? Bring your enthusiasm, bring your naivety, because that's your role. Which I think is, I don't know, I guess that also hints at why she was so successful, that she was able to evolve with that role within the crew, within the squad, and within the wider team.
Do you think that regardless of the sport, any athlete, they have to evolve to continue to stay in their sport for a sustained long period of time?
I would say definitely. Yeah, I would say. I mean, certainly that experience piece. I mean, I think when I was young and not very experienced, I used to think, why do people always bang on about experience? It doesn't necessarily mean you're any good. It just means you've done it before. And then when I started to be, when I've been around for a few years, I thought, actually, experience is really valuable. Actually, I think it's very important. And I don't think it necessarily, it doesn't mean you're going to win the race. It just gives you options. It just means when you're in a situation, you look around, you say, right, I've been here before. We tried this before. This worked. This didn't work. That's not to say it might again, but it's almost like you've got more tricks in your toolbox. Whereas first time round, you've never. I guess it's a bit like parenting. Having your first child is very different to having your second child, because it's a path you've already walked down. And yeah, it's still wonderful and exciting and terrifying and anxious and all the rest of it, but it's familiar. And I think experience. And this is something I talk about in the book, is this idea of instinct. People talk about, oh, so-and-so, he's an instinctive racer, or she's an instinctive team player. And I don't feel that that's the right word. I think when people say instinct, they mean experience. How can somebody instinctively be a good rower? It's not it's not something that we've been doing for millions of years since we were all living in caves. Instinct is jumping if a fly lands on your arm. So I think when people say instinct, they just mean experience. They mean somebody has developed an intuitive feel for their sport because they've been doing it for a while.
And you think that's another quality that can be trained as well, right?
I do. I mean that is one of the messages in the book, is that I think all mental skills are infinite. All mental skills can be trained. And I guess a bit like physical skills will be, myself and somebody of my age and my size and my, physiology could do the same training, and I might be better than them at some things. They might be better than me at some things. That's the way it goes. And I think it's exactly the same with mental training. You could take two people with a similar background, similar experiences as a kid, and you say to the both of them, right, how can you be a really good team player? Let's work on your teamwork. Let's work on that mental skill, mental attribute. And you know what? One person will find it easier than the other person. That's just, that's humans. We're all, we're all different, and we're all irrational. But I absolutely think that there's no such thing as a set mind. I think, of course, mental skills are trained. If you don't believe that you can train mental skills, then you don't believe you can train physical skills. We are malleable. We're adjustable. We're adaptable. We're human beings.
Yeah. That's awesome. So, throughout your time researching the book and writing the book, and learning that, right, especially from all these different examples of other athletes, would you take any of that knowledge and, like, if you could go back in time, like, apply that to yourself or your teammates and try to use some of those tools to just kind of work?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why that's partly why the book was just so fascinating, getting that diversity of experience. So I talked to between 60 and 70 elite athletes, coaches and psychologists from across a variety of sports, men, women, team sports, individual sports, people who had won multiple medals and people who hadn't been to the games yet. And so to get that diversity of experience was just eye-opening. And, I really wish that somebody else had written the book and given it to me as a 16-year-old, because I think it would have been, just really beneficial. And I honestly think that if there's one key message to come out of the book, it's that everyone's different. Everyone is different. And even to take the team individual bit, I spent a few days with the British boxing team, and there was one guy there and he'd played rugby to quite a high level as a kid. And I said, how come you quit rugby? And he was in an academy for a professional club. He said, I hated being in a team. He said, I hated the fact that I could play really well, but we'd still lose the match. I wasn't happy. And I was also boxing at the same time. I just thought boxing is my sport. It's an individual sport. When I'm in the ring, it's just me. And I thought, wow, that's fascinating, because I'm sure I could sit down with somebody else and they'd say, I hate training on my own. I'm all about the team. I'm totally motivated by the team. To the same, both elite athletes, but two very different people. And certainly that's one of the joys of sport, is you can have people who are really emotional and really driven by their passion, and really on the eve of a race or a match, they'll be firing themselves up. They'll have their headphones on, they'll have the music pumping. You've got other people who'll be sitting there before a race doing needlework and knitting and chilling and listening to classical music. They will both perform to 100% of their ability, but they're in completely different mental states to do it. And I think, the key message from the book is that you've just got to find what works for you. Yeah. And that'll be different to everyone else. But once you find what works for you, with regards to your confidence, with regards how you get yourself ready to compete, with regards to resilience, with regards being coached, all the other myriad of mental skills, once you've figured out what works for you, stick with that.
Yeah, that takeaway jumped out at me. There's a lot of different approaches for all the athletes,
for sure.
But also there's no one path to success. You can have success Definitely. A lot of different ways too. So shifting gears a little bit. So one final area I wanted to talk about from chapter 4 was happiness. And you had this really good few sentences here that I pulled out. So happiness in elite sport is different from happiness in everyday life. And so, why is this a critical piece for non-athletes to understand, and how can it impact friendships, family, and relationships? Because I think before you go to answer that, maybe it'd be helpful to be like, okay, here's my day when I was on the GB team. I woke up at this time all the way to this time, and this is what I did in between, to give somebody kind of a snapshot of one day, how that's different than maybe going to the office from 8 or 9 to 5.
Okay, cool. So when I was on the rowing team, we used to meet at our training centre at about 7:30 in the morning. We'd have a quick chat from our coach, and then we'd head out on the water, normally in our single sculls, and we'd do our first session, which was always 18 to 20k, which is about an hour and 45, just low intensity, steady state. Then we'd come in, we'd have our second breakfast, then second session was often on the row machines. So again, we do about 18k on the row machines, which is about an hour and 15. And then we'd have a lunch break. And then at mid-afternoon, we'd either sometimes have a nap, or we might have meetings or analysis, physiotherapy, massages, whatever. And then we'd meet for weights at about 4:00 in the evening, or 4:00 in the afternoon. We do a strength and conditioning session in the gym. It's normally about 45 minutes conditioning and 45 minutes weights. But then after that, sometimes have an ice bath, but normally not, because they're so uncomfortable. And then I'd head home, have a massive dinner, probably go to bed at 9, I should imagine.
And wake up and do it again.
Hopefully not get a knock on the door from the drugs tester at 10 p.m. That was always the dream.
Yeah. So you're doing that every day, right? And so that's, you said hour 45, and then 2:45 weights and conditioning. So you're looking at, at least 4.5 hours, at least, of training a day, right?
Yeah.
So again, just to kind of give some more perspective, that's 4.5 hours of physical training a day, aside from meetings, discussion, strategy, that type of thing.
Stretching, recovery,
warm up,
massages,
cool
ice
down,
bath.
right? And that's a lot different than someone going to the gym to take a class or to get in their own training session for 45 to 60 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So in your day to day, right? How did you and how did some of the other elite athletes find kind of happiness in that daily grind? Because that's a lot. It's taxing physically, mentally. You get into those hard, gray, dark days of winter, and it's not always pleasant.
Yeah, but it's one of those things. If it's your normality, then it's normal, and I think that's true of everyone, isn't it? You've got people who, gosh, they commute into big cities for 2 hours a day on a packed commuter train. And I look at them and I think, how can you do that? That must be horrendous. You spend an hour there and an hour back, squashed in like sardines. But they'll say, well, this is what I always do. This is what my friends do. It's fine. It's okay. So I guess everyone's normality is their normality. I think in elite sport, and I'm sure on their own team, we weren't unique in this. We'd often talk about normal life or normal people, as this kind of like, oh, that's not us. That's people who don't do sport. And it does mean that, your idea of normality is a bit warped. So if somebody said to me, God, you look like a real beast today, I'd say, oh, thank you very much. That's very kind. I can see it as a compliment because it means that I was, putting on muscle and looking fit and strong, which is what I wanted. Eating whatever 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day, that was normal. I mean, if I try to do it now, I think I'd really struggle. But back then, I just put it away. I didn't even think about it. And again, you don't jump straight into this. You kind of build up to it. You've been rowing for a long time. You've always had that, that structure of training in your day. Rowing is a sport where you do have to train hard. So you've always had that idea that you train in the mornings, train in the evenings, and then twice on a Saturday, twice on a Sunday. And then it gradually just everything else fades away and there's just rowing. But in the UK, we're really lucky to have funding from the National Lottery. So we get paid to train full time, which is wonderful. It's just normal. And I think within that, you also end up with some quite big personalities. And I think that's one of the things that elite sport really attracts is you do get some really big personalities who find it hilarious to push themselves till they vomit. Or, you get used to the fact that you take communal showers with each other 3 times a day, and that's totally normal. And share hotel rooms with everyone well into your mid-30s. But it's normal. It's normal, and the idea of happiness. And I suppose I really wanted to drill down what is happiness, because again, the reference points for your happiness is probably different to most people, but you still get the same buzz and satisfaction. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not really into movies. I'm not really that interested in it. But there's some people who, if there's a new Star Wars movie coming out, they will queue through the night in order to watch it when the day gets released. Well, I don't fancy doing that. That doesn't excite me at all, or that's not happiness to me. But for them, that is happiness. That's what they want to do. So I think it just reminds us that, again, we're all unique. We're all a bit different. And again, once you're in that environment of elite sport, you train yourself. You're surrounded by people doing the same as you, and you train those mental skills and your mental reality, your impression of reality, so that is happiness for you. And you tell yourself you're happy.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes you look back and you think, this life I live is crazy. It's just ridiculous.
Well, so one of the other questions I had is in happiness, did you or some of your teammates did you utilize humor on a regular basis?
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely. And I don't know if that's a really British thing as well, just to have that real self-deprecating humor all the time about, because some training sessions, I mean, I'm not saying that doing elite sport for a living is tough. It really isn't tough compared to, people who are struggling to pay the rent. But some training sessions are physically really hard. And you do, you might have a little cry. You might have a bit of a vomit at the end. And people laugh at each other, and that's part of keeping your spirits up, isn't it? I think that's part of what makes us human is even when it's really dark and you're struggling to get through it, you can poke fun at the person next to you, and that makes you feel better.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So shifting gears to chapter 5, and
Yeah.
this one's about personality, and you kind of kick off this chapter with the 3-step theory of athlete personality, and I believe this is something you kind of developed through your research and writing the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
And so the 3 steps are boredom threshold, mind control, mindfulness, and reflection. So
Yeah.
my first question is, how did you develop that theory? And then could you talk about each of those and why they may or may not be important to sport?
I think through the course of writing the book, it started off as a 1-step theory of athlete personality, and then it became a 10-step theory, and then it eventually got narrowed down to 3. I guess I wanted to think of the specific things as an athlete you need to be good at. And I say you need to be good at, and I mean you need to have trained your ability to be good at them. So the first one is boredom threshold. You think about the majority of elite sport training, it's repetition, repetition, repetition. As we all know, success in sport comes from getting the basics right. In my sport of rowing, we just did one thing. We just did a rowing stroke. Football, rugby, swimming. Ultimately, there's just 1 or 2 things that you need to be good at. So you just need to repeat those things again and again and again and again, and you just learn how to deal with the fact that your life is based on repetition. And to be honest, I now have a toddler, and that's all he wants to do. He finds something he enjoys, he just wants to do it again and again and again and again. And I think, oh, it's just like I'm back in the rowing machine. Lovely. But I think boredom threshold. I mean, I use the word boredom threshold slightly lightheartedly. I don't mean elite sport is boring. I mean, it can seem boring, but as an athlete, again, you develop the ability to shoulder the burden of all the practice, and you develop the ability to not be bored. When, if you ask me now, right, go rowing for an hour and 45 minutes, I'd probably be pretty bored. I'd probably find that really boring because I'm not the person I used to be. But back then, I would have found it really exciting, and I would have found moments of excitement throughout that long, boring session to keep me buzzing and to keep me, to keep me going. So the second key skill is mind control, and I think this is the one which I still use now, which is essentially you tell yourself what you need to hear. So if you're about to face some 7-foot tall Ukrainian women that you've never even seen before, do you know what? You can still tell yourself that you can beat them. Are you lying to yourself? Probably. Are you delusional? Absolutely. But do you need to be? Yes. And that's why you see, the David and Goliath moments in sport. Because one athlete said, look, I don't care that the form guide says you should beat me. I'm going to try and beat you. And the reason they can do that, and the reason they can absolutely believe in it 1,000%, is because they've practiced mind control. And they're able to control, those emotional reactions. So the normal person in the street would think, oh gosh, yeah, but I'm telling myself I'm going to beat these people, but I don't really believe it. Whereas an athlete is able to clear those emotional thoughts from their head and say, no, I can definitely do this. Here are my reasons for believing this. I can definitely do this. And afterwards you look back and you laugh and you think, why did I ever think I was going to beat that person? But at the time, you genuinely believe it. You genuinely do. And that's something that you build up over years and years of training, is trusting in your plan and believing in yourself. And then thirdly, mindfulness and reflection. I mean, I really think reflection is the diet of champions. You don't get anywhere in life, in sport, without being able to reflect on yourself, reflect on your performance, and take criticism. Criticism in elite sport is generally pretty brutal because, there's no point dressing something up as a nice message if you've just lost a race you wanted to win. Actually, following that race, you want to know from your coach, what exactly do I need to do in order to win that race the next time, or win that match, or beat that opponent? You don't want that dressed up as you don't want to be treated with care and respect. You just want the information. I don't care how you deliver it to me. Tell me I'm mentally weak. Tell me I'm soft. Whatever it is you think I need to improve on, I'm going to go and improve on it. And it's reflection. It's constantly holding a mirror up to yourself and saying, what am I doing well? What can I do better? Where do I need to improve? And again, that's something I try and carry on doing in my life now, but probably not as brutally as I used to do it.
Well, that was fantastic. Thanks you for breaking all three of those down. The one of the examples that jumped out at me, um, that I remember from the book really
Mm.
well was when Adrian Cassidy talked about I
Yeah,
think you were doing the hour or maybe it was the 18K erg, and the CD player started skipping, I
yeah,
guess pretty early on, and you just like completely kind of blocked it out and finished the entire piece. Um, you know, being able to just focus on, that screen, the monitor in front of you, and not the distraction to the side.
yeah. So I mean, so Adrian Cassidy was my first coach when I was at university, and took me onto the British rowing team and to a under 23 medal on the way. And I said to him when we met, when I was writing the book, I said, when was the moment that you thought I might be okay and I might be able to, take my rowing one step further? And he said it was this ergo that you did when you were an undergraduate at Cambridge and the CD player was skipping, and you did your entire ergo with the CD player skipping on one song. And he said there's not many people who wouldn't have got off and either kicked the CD player across the room or sorted out the scratched CD. He said the fact that you were able just to block it out and carry on with your training, I thought, do you know what? She'll do anything that she needs to do to reach the top.
I love
So I don't remember it.
it.
But for him, it was this really critical kind of key moment in our relationship. Whereas, I don't know, it's gone, it's lost in the mists of my memory.
Awesome. Very cool. So why do you think, and you touch on this in the book, but for the listeners, like why are mental skills different for each sport, and why is it probably important that they're different for each sport?
Well, because they have to be. I mean, every sport is so different. You wouldn't expect somebody who is a shot putter to look the same as somebody who is a horse rider. You'd expect them to have completely different physical muscles and physical shape. In the same way, mentally, they're going to be completely different. The mental skills that you need to say, I don't know, be a marathon runner are completely different to the mental skills you need to play in the NFL. That's just the nature of the sport, the two different sports. My sport was all about, like I've said, repetition. It was about being very self-motivated. It was about enjoying the challenge of all the endurance training. So those were my mental skills. That was the stuff I was good at. If you'd asked me to play, I don't know, hockey, netball, football, basketball, a free moving sport where it's chaotic, it's a chaotic environment, you're constantly making decisions, there's another team right in your face. Actually, I would have completely struggled because those aren't my mental skills. Had I been a hockey player since I was 5, I'm sure I would have had those skills to think on my feet and be able to slow down the information and make those decisions and communicate with my teammates. But I didn't need to be good at that, so I wasn't. And I found that quite interesting. Then you've got sports like, I guess, like baseball. I was about to say cricket, but I think of an American version. Baseball, where it's one moment. If the batter makes a mistake, he's messed up, and that's it. In rowing, endurance sports, running, swimming, you don't have that critical moment. There is no one moment that you have to get it right when everyone's looking at you. So again, it's so fascinating that each sport, which is why, again, people who can compete in lots of different sports to a high level, I find just so impressive that they can, take one hat off and put a different hat on and be equally good.
Yeah, that's kind of almost a unique skill set in and of itself, right there.
Yeah, definitely.
So shifting to kind of chapter 6, that whole chapter is centered around confidence.
Yeah.
You had this great quote. Confidence doesn't mean not self-questioning, but it maybe means not self-criticizing.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that?
So, I mean, I'm not going to claim this quote. This was Chrissy Wellington, who I'm sure your listeners will know, 4-time Ironman world champion. So I said to her, what is confidence? What does it mean to you? And she said, what you've just said to me. Confidence doesn't mean not self-questioning, and it means not self-criticizing. So you can question your performance. You can question, why wasn't I very fast today? Or why wasn't that quite up to scratch? Or why was that really good today? But you never self-criticize. You never conclude that the answer to that question is, maybe I'm just not very good. Maybe I'm not good enough to be here. Maybe I'm just not of the caliber to be a world champion. And I think, to me, that's one of the fundamentals of confidence. It is that word belief. It's that, do you know what? I might not get it right today. I might not ever get it right, but I do have the capacity to be good enough to be here. Again, that word good enough. I'm good enough to compete on the world stage. I'm good enough theoretically to win the Olympic Games. There's no reason stopping me. And I think a lot of the general public presume that all elite athletes have that. But of course you believe you're good enough. Look at you, you're competing for your country. And the answer is, well, actually, no, lots of people don't really believe they're good enough until they've been in the system for sometimes quite a long time. And they need that evidence, and they need the affirmation that they are good enough, which is why I call the chapter the confidence wand, because I'm saying there is no confidence wand. You can't wave a magic wand and suddenly someone can say, oh, do you know what? Actually, yeah, I do believe that I can compete for my country. I do believe I can become a full international. Because why would they suddenly believe that plucked out of thin air? That's a journey that everybody goes on. And some people achieve it when they're young. Some people never, ever get there and never quite believe that they're good enough. And I can certainly think of people on the rowing team in that category who, always needed convincing right up until the end of their careers that, look, you can do this. You are good enough to be here. So I found the whole subject of confidence just fascinating because everybody defines it so differently. And it's everyone has come up with their individual definition of what it is.
Yeah, that was very clear. Pretty much every person you talked to had a different take on what it meant to them and kind of how it related to their training and their performance and preparation. And then you talk about in that chapter the importance, in sport of having a world-class work ethic. And then also probably as athletes become a little bit more mature in their careers of moderating it and making sure that, in some ways they trust themselves, they trust their training, that they don't have to kind of overdo it.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess I saw that as almost the point at which people genuinely are confident when they can say, do you know what, I've done enough today, or I'm just not quite right, or the reason I messed up today is because I'm just a bit tired. And the ability to step back and say, no, I'm not going to do any more. And one of my interviewees, Goldie Sayers, who's a GB javelin thrower, she said to me, it takes more guts to do nothing than it takes to train. And I completely agree. As athletes and people in other professions, people in high performing professions, they're there because they work blooming hard, and they're there because they've always had that work ethic and they've always wanted to try and better themselves. That's the nature of achieving a high performing level in any job, any industry. But you have to be able also to turn that down. You also have to be able to say, but if I do any more, I'll just be beating myself up. And that's the point. The easy option is to say, right, I'm going to train harder. I'm going to get to my training centre 10 minutes earlier tomorrow so I can do more. But is that the best thing for you? Not always.
Yeah. Do you think that concept of moderating it, is that harder for younger athletes to necessarily be able to do, or did that come, like for you, did that come a little bit easier as you had more experience, you were in the international competition scene?
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a key mental skill that you learn. It's something that you only develop with time, a bit like experience, just being able to know your body better, know your situation, your environment better, and be able to listen to your body.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead to some of the next points from chapter 7. And Anna Watkins talks about being hyped up versus being anxious and trying to kind of find that equilibrium, that right balance to be able to perform at a high level. And so take us through, I guess, maybe either the example from Anna or from yourself, if you want, of, kind of getting ready for, going to the start line, getting ready to, race 2,000 meters. You need to be able to pull out this performance and demand your body goes flat out. But at the same time, there's a highly technical component, to the rowing stroke, especially depending on the weather conditions, that type of thing. And
Absolutely, yeah.
Your cadence is up at 36 to 40 strokes a minute.
Yeah, for sure.
So if you're too revved up, you might make some sloppy mistakes with the oar. So how do you find the right balance, and what are some of the things that Anna talked about and some of the other athletes?
So a phrase that Brian Moore used, who's an England rugby player, he used the phrase controlled belligerents, which I think is brilliant. I love it. Controlled belligerents. So you have to be full of fight, but it has to be controlled. It has to be in your control. So it has to be in your hands. And that's, I guess, where you see, particularly in team sports, players getting into fights, getting sent off. Well, that's because they're too belligerent and not enough controlled belligerents. Sorry, too belligerent without any control. And I think everybody goes through a process of understanding where they sit on that spectrum between control and belligerence. One of the boxers that I spoke to described it as fire and ice. You need the fire, but you also need the ice. Ice in the mind, fire in the belly, so they say. I think in my own experience, I definitely started off being too much fire, too much belligerence, because I thought that's what you needed to do. If you want to race for your country, you need to be absolutely spitting blood on the start line. And then after a few years, I realised, it's not doing anything for me. This is not my best way to perform. And so I experimented with moving further back along that spectrum towards the ice, towards the control, and eventually found that I needed to be really relaxed. I needed to be just that person sat in the back of the boat shed, chilling, chatting to my friends, because that was the way that got the right mindset in me to get the most out of myself to race. And that really surprised me.
My question for you is, because I know you talked about that, was that self-discovery? Did you figure that on your own, or was that through help from, support from the team or sports psychologists? Like, how did you figure that out?
That was definitely with help from our sports psychologist, Chris Schambrook.
Okay.
So he was the guy who really kind of sat down with me and said, you always seem pretty nervous before races. Are those nerves good nerves or bad nerves? And I said, no, they're absolutely awful, crippling nerves. And he kind of pointed out the obvious and said, crippling nerves? Is that the way to compete in sport? And it made me think, oh, right, maybe not. Maybe he's right. No, he definitely kind of held my hand and made me understand how to experiment.
Okay, very cool. One thing that jumped out too, at least from a kind of a training perspective, there was just like one line on it. It talked about on race day, you and your teammates, you would perform med ball slams. Some of that, I think, was to kind of you get a testosterone release, get some of the endorphins going.
Yeah, testosterone.
Did you find that doing that type of activity, got you ready for racing, but also kind of just took a little bit of the edge off?
Yeah. I mean, we did it for physiological reasons. There was some research that came out, which I'm sure you know all about, saying that actually to get this testosterone spike, I don't know, a certain number of hours before you race was a good thing to do. But also, I think we just loved it because it was just this emotional release. You picked up a medicine ball and just hurled it at the ground as hard as you possibly can. You probably let out a roar while you did it. And actually, if you're sitting around feeling jittery, waiting to go race a world championship final, this is just the thing you want to do. Yeah. So I guess it started out as a physical thing and then became a bit of an emotional release.
I've got some folks that I work with that enjoy it after a long day at the office too.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure. I mean, I would recommend it to anyone. If you're struggling with your children and you don't want to hit them, do a medicine ball slam. If you don't like your boss, slam a medicine ball into the ground. It's great.
More specific question for the rowing community: how many hours before would you do that? Like at the regatta course, or do you remember?
I mean, this is going back a few years now. I mean, I want to say that we do it maybe 2 hours before we raced, something like that, 2 to 3 hours.
Okay, cool.
But who knows? I mean, like anything in sport, there's the perfect of what you should do to prepare for a race, and then there's the practical of what's possible. What have we got room for? Do we have resources? Is there time, and all the rest of it? So,
love it. Okay, one of the great concepts that you talked about in this chapter too that jumped out at me. Going back to one of the key themes for the book was, these are all mental skills. People are not born with them. They can be trained and developed. And so one of the things you talk about specifically in this chapter is training your brain to deliver your routine, so your performance, regardless of the circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. So again, race day comes, there's nerves, there's expectation, there's all the other athletes wandering around, it's very much the end of your journey. And I do think that what you need to do, is just have the ability to say, you know what, my body doesn't know it's, my body is just my body. The boat doesn't know that it's race day. The blades, the oars don't know it's race day. The water doesn't know it's race day. So you need to develop the ability to know that your brain is going to be predictable, and that it's not going to suddenly, you're not going to suddenly lose your confidence or become really anxious on race day. And that's part of why you rehearse and practice so many times, is you're practicing those routines, those practical strategies, so that you're not going to suddenly lose it. Mm-hmm. You're not suddenly going to go, oh my God, I can't do this, because there's so many emotions flying around your body. I mean, and it's one of those things that I try and think, sometimes I think about it now, I try and put myself back into what it feels like to row to the start of a major final. And I just can't even put myself back in that state of mind, because it's like no other experience. It really isn't. All those thoughts and emotions and energy flying around your body. And what you want to do is channel every single one into your performance, into your racing. And that's, to me, is what brainwashing is about. It's that, you make your brain and your mental state and your thoughts predictable, in the same way that on race day you have a predictable warm-up routine, you have a predictable time you stretch, and you talk to your coach or whatever your routine is. So I think it's just exactly the same. It's having a routine for what you're going to do with your brain.
Yes, and that allows you to get right back into the right mindset, which is going to lead you to have that top performance that you want.
Exactly.
Excellent. So there was there's a phrase you mentioned in the book, and I couldn't find it anywhere else. So I was hoping that when we sat down today, you could tell me what this is. You mentioned a red mist moment. What is red mist?
Well, maybe this is something that we only use on the British rowing team. I don't know. Well, red mist is, it's the last couple of minutes of the race. It's when you're neck and neck with another crew. There's a gold medal on the line, and you're not really part of reality anymore. You're just you're just subsumed into this, this charging machine of power and shouting and noise and racing. And I think you get, and I think the red mist, all it means is you reach deeper into your soul than you ever do in training. There's a reason that people set world records in Olympic finals, because they go harder than they ever knew they could. And I think part of the red mist is making sure that happens. It's not just that you're caught up and strung up in the racing and you lose your mind. It's that you're still executing your processes, you're still executing your best performances, but you suddenly find more energy and more power than you ever thought you could, I would say. I mean, awesome. This doesn't happen to me anymore.
No, that's great. I was hoping that you could shed some light on that. I've never heard of that phrase until.
I thought it was a phrase really common in rowing, but maybe not.
No, that's cool. Maybe we have a different name for it, or we.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah. Very cool. So, one of the last chapters is becoming a carrot farmer, and this is all about kind of coaching. And you do a great job of juxtapositioning sort of the qualities of what makes a good athlete and then like what makes a good coach. And they're not necessarily the same thing. And if you're a great athlete, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a very good coach.
Not at all. And a lot of people, I think this is quite a common phrase, is that the best athletes make the worst coaches, the worst athletes make the best coaches. Because if you've never struggled with something, if you've just taken to everything quite easily and learned quite easily, how can you ever explain it to someone else? How can you ever hold someone's hand and describe to them that the every tiny step to get there if you've never been through those steps yourself? But at the same time, I guess and I suppose that is borne out. If you look at the top coaches in the world across a multitude of sports, generally they weren't the first choice in their position when they were playing, or they weren't, maybe they didn't even play for their country. But coaching, that's where they found their niche.
Yeah. Yeah. Adrian Cassidy had this great quote in there. He said, "The line between coaching and therapy is tiny."
Yeah, I love it. But it is, the coach sees you at your best. He or she sees you at your worst. He or she picks you up when you're down. He or she is there to celebrate with you after you win the World Championships. And they are therapists. And really, for particularly the younger athletes, they're the most important person in your life after your parents. The most influential person in your life. And that's why I think coaches need to understand that, and they need to be wary of how much power they have.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I work a lot with middle school and high school athletes as well. And, I certainly try to keep in context all the time that, I know they want to get better. The high school athletes are kind of at that age where they're taking it a little bit more seriously. But I think I always try to make sure that they're laughing and smiling and having fun, because I think there's plenty of time to be plenty serious about sport later on.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Another thing that jumped out was, I'm not quite sure who said this, but coaches have all the responsibility, but no power over the outcome once competition begins.
Indeed. So I'm pretty sure the person who I quoted this for was Stuart Lancaster, who was the former England rugby coach. So pretty senior guy. And I think, and when I put that quote to other coaches, they all said, "Yeah, but that's the reality. That's the game. That's what we do. If you're frustrated about that, don't be a coach." Particularly in rowing, when you push the athletes off the pontoon to go out and race the World Championship final, you're gone. You've got nothing else to do. You could just sit there and have a cigarette because your work is done. But if they win or lose the race, the first people are to point, that you're the person who gets the finger pointed at them. Right. So, and again, I think if we talk about key skills of coaching, what makes a good coach? Number one, probably that they were a bad athlete. But number two, being comfortable with that, being comfortable with the fact that you have a huge amount of power, you have a huge amount of responsibility, but there is an end to it. That is finite. There is a thick line where that power stops and the athlete has complete control over everything else. And again, there's some coaches, I think, who find that very frustrating, but they're probably not the guys who are going to get to the top.
Yeah, and you talk about that. You talk about, some of the best coaches, they really empower, they give their athletes ownership of themselves. Definitely, and make them part of the process. Yeah,
definitely. So Mel Marshall, who's a British coach who coaches a guy called Adam Peaty, who's a multiple Olympic champion swimmer and an absolute standout star. This is her big thing. She said, "I coach from the inside out. I coach the person. I get to know them as a person. I get to know them as an individual." And she says, "There's things that I can do and there's things I can't do." And so one of my big things is I don't coach desire. If they don't want to do it, if they're not prepared to go on that journey, that tough, demanding journey where they will have to give up everything, I can't push them. I really can't. If that, that has to be their choice and their choice alone. And again, I think some coaches do try to teach desire. If they find a really talented kid, they'll try and push them into their sport. Whereas actually, if that kid doesn't want to be there, you cannot force it.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree. Stuart had another really good quote, and I really like this. He said, "Do you take the right tools out of the toolbox at the right time?" And to me, that is a really good example of that blending of the art of coaching with the science of coaching. You know what I mean? And that art part of being able to strike a balance and knowing when to press in or pull back.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And again, I just think that comes with experience. Are you saying the right things at the right time? Some people, and every athlete is different. Some people want the big picture painted. They want the rousing motivational speech. Some athletes want the detail. They want to see the spreadsheets. They want to see the training program. They want to have control and accountability over it. Some athletes just say, "Tell me what to do, and I'll go off and do it." And a mark of good coaching, I think, is being able to adapt your style, your methods, your type of communication to what your athlete needs.
Yeah, and you talk about that in this chapter specifically, and I actually think that's probably one of, if not the biggest challenges, because it's not like you're changing the message, but you're sort of altering how you communicate it to these individuals.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. Some athletes need an arm around the shoulder. Some just need a bit of a G up. Some need a specific instruction. And yeah, that's good coaching. But then that's good managing as well, isn't it? It's no different to the workplace. If you're a good manager, you can inspire loads of different types of people.
100%.
Thank you for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. If this content is important to you, please be sure to rate and review so more people can listen. Also, you may follow me on social media, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook to get weekly free content. For more in-depth content, please subscribe to my email newsletter at my website, leotraining.io. Be sure to check out the resources page to download free, helpful content. If you have any questions or feedback, please contact me directly by email at joe@leotraining.io or via Instagram. The handle is @leotraining. Thank you again for listening and have a great day.